Welcome, everybody. We have three panelists who are each, in their own right, hardcore New Yorkers. Julie Samuels is the executive director of Tech NYC. Ben Sun is the co-founder of Primary Venture Partners, and Karen Bhatia is the senior vice president for tech at NYC EDC. So first of all, just so that everyone sees that you're here, let's give them all a big hand by clipping on the applause below. You know, strangely, that never gets old. All right, so I thought I would start off. I was going to read your LinkedIn bios and talk about all the great work you've done, and then I was realizing that everyone can do that on their own. So instead, I'm going to ask a different question for each of our panelists. Tell us a story of something that happened to you, either in your careers or in your personal life, that fits into the category of only in New York. A great connection, a discovery, a bit of kismet, that is why you love New York. And I'm going to start with Karen, because I have a feeling you have a great story to tell us.
I hope it lives up to that expectation, Steve. Good morning, everyone. Karen Bhatia. So I came to this country when I was 2 years old. I came from Brazil and grew up in Queens. And this, I think, is the typical Queens story. Went to public schools, and it was an incredible experience. I grew up in Flushing. And there I had the experience with such diversity in the students that I went to school with. You know, we would celebrate Ramadan, Chinese New Year, Kwanzaa, Diwali. We would get kimbap as snacks in school. And, a number of our teachers were Jewish. And so you had a bunch of these like immigrant kids running around saying like Yiddish words. And, it was just such the quintessential New York experience growing up with such diversity that, even to this day, my brother and I, we would like communicate to each other and say like, you have such chutzpah. I can't imagine that and it's just an incredible growing up experience. And when I went to college, I thought, everybody grew up like that, but it's such a quintessential New York experience for a kid to grow up in public schools with such diversity, especially in a place like Queens.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you. Perfect. Ben, tell us a New York story.
So just like Karen, I was actually grew up in Queens as well, actually in Flushing as well, Karen. I was born and raised in New York. My parents were entrepreneurs and had a couple Chinese restaurants in the city. And when I was, young, like 7 or 8 years old, I used to go and work there in the weekends, bus tables. My dad used to drive me to apartment buildings. I'd run up the food. But I remember one day on a weekend, I was bussing a table in the restaurant in Tribeca. It was on the corner of Chambers Street and West Broadway. And I was kind of looking out the window and I saw a guy with some white chalk, draw these like human outline figures on the wall, and this black wall in this parking lot across the street. And I was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. I thought the drawings were pretty cool. Only to find out years later that was Keith Haring. So anyway, that's definitely feels like a New York City quintessential moment. So
that's a fantastic story. All right, Julie, see if you can beat those two great New York stories.
I don't think I can, especially Keith Haring randomly. That's an amazing New York story. But actually, after hearing your two stories, I'm going to change my plan a little bit because I didn't grow up in New York. I grew up in Chicago. And I think there's this thing, particularly in politics, which I spend a lot of time working in, where people like to talk about how, I'm born and bred New Yorker. And I think that's great. Like I'm raising born and bred New Yorkers. But I also think there's something to be said for those of us who come here who are born to be New Yorkers. And I am one of those people who was born to be a New Yorker. And the moment, I'll tell you the moment I knew, though it's not as lighthearted, but I was 23, I guess, and I was here on September 11th, and I was just down the block. I was on like Broadway. And I was there when the planes hit. But I'd gotten out of there when the buildings fell. And then I was here for a year after that. And I left and I went to law school that August. And the resiliency of the city and of the people who were here for that year made clear to me that I was always going to be a New Yorker. And then I spent like almost over a decade, like 13 years before I made it back. I went to law school. I lived in Chicago. I spent a lot of time in Nashville. I lived in San Francisco. The whole time I knew I was going to come back to New York. I always knew. It was just like life kind of kept getting in the way, and jobs and family and whatever. But I knew after that year, after being here, that I was always a New Yorker. And I finally came back, and here I am. So not as like lighthearted of a story, but I think one important nonetheless.
So I'll tell mine. So I born in New York, went to college in upstate New York, started a company. Company was growing and thought I was going to stay there forever. And we had a television series that I was producing out of Saratoga Springs that was on WPIX. And the woman who was the head of programming at WPIX at the time said to me, Steve, why the bleep are you in upstate New York? She said, every time I dial 518, I think, who the bleep are you? She's like, if you would move to New York, your company would double in size. And I talked to my friends. They're like, no, New York will eat your lunch. It's expensive. You can't. And so I changed our phone number to a 212 number. So it would forward from the upstate number. And she called me about a week afterwards and she said, we know you're forwarding your phone. We could hear the click when it forwards. You're still in upstate New York. She said, you know, New York is the city that's so nice they named it twice. She's like, there's no golden invitation to move here. Just get on the train, pick your ass up and move to New York. And I moved my whole company. I had 40 employees. We moved to New York and we doubled in size in a year. And I've never looked back. And so, all right. So let's get into tech in New York. First question, just to start on a light note, I want to start with the Great Exodus. So 18 months ago, COVID arrived in New York, and we all had friends. Some of us did, no guilt here, that bailed. They moved. They went to the Hamptons. They went to Miami. They went upstate. They went to, they all had reasons. They were taking care of their family or their older parents. But it came down to this fear of the unknown, an unknown illness, changes in New York, danger. How did it affect you guys, your companies, your portfolios? How did startups that you nurture adjust to this rapid, momentary, it turns out, we hope, a journey out of New York? Great exodus.
I can start. I think that the Great Exodus was overrated. I think obviously now, but I think the whole time even it was overrated. I do think a lot of people left, particularly last summer. But at least in the tech sector, and Karen and Ben, I'd love to hear if your experience has been the same. Unlike a lot of other sectors in the city, tech people I know in tech largely are committed to New York and aren't going anywhere. I have a lot of theories as to why. I think we can kind of get into that later. But what that meant is that even if people were going, people were going by their families, if they had kids, so they could have grandparents around or whatever. A lot of people I knew were like, oh, but we'll be back in the fall. And they were back. They were all back when school started. So I think that companies, for tech companies, large and small, startups to the bigger employers, the transition to a remote workplace was pretty seamless because tech companies, unlike other firms, largely had the tools in place and employees had comfort with platforms like this great platform that we're using to go remote pretty seamlessly. And a lot of the companies we work with, I think in the immediate days, there was a lot of fear what's going to happen, but it was pretty quickly clear that tech companies are going to navigate this moment pretty well. And in fact, many of them in New York, particularly in the health tech space, completely rose to the occasion and did incredibly well because of COVID.
Yeah, I would say on our end, running a venture firm and having, 60 startups in the New York City area that are in our portfolio, we definitely had a good view on what was happening kind of in their mindset. My partner and I have been through a whole bunch of cycles. So as Julie kind of mentioned, going through 9/11 and seeing what that's like as a business was a challenging time. And then we had the financial crisis and all those times there was skepticism if New York would ever rebound back. And my partner and I just knew the city's resiliency. And we just said, it's going to come back. But we were just really nervous about what the pandemic would mean. And so did the founders. And you go from a business where we're investing in growth to now saying, you know what, preserve capital, because if this is going to be really bad, us, VCs won't be able to get our investors to put money in our funds. And so you saw a lot of, companies put employees on furlough, do layoffs, kind of slow down growth, but then slow down their burn. And that was pretty rough for a couple months. So starting from, I'd say March through, early summer. But then by, I'd say early fall, it just really bounced back. We saw, technology for the most part thrive in most of the categories that we're in. The market obviously started rebounding back. So, capital felt like it was going to be still there. And companies started kind of rehiring again really rapidly. And so if you kind of look at the recovery of New York City and the so-called exodus, maybe that exodus lasted really for a few months. But the rebound's been amazing. And if you look over the last 2-3 quarters, in terms of early stage VC rounds, it's been record years for New York City, since the very beginning. So, and by a good amount. So it's been a pretty amazing sight to see.
Same thing that we've seen also from the programs that we run. And so we have a number of programs that are accelerators and incubators, and the companies that are in those and the operators that we have, particularly the academic institutions, were incredible in being able to pivot really rapidly, have the companies go online, continue with the programming, any kind of events that they were having. I mean, it was definitely different in nature than those in-person events. And we consistently heard about not only conferences, but instances in which you have potential investors, angel or VCs, meeting with folks remotely, and how different that was. And, missing the times in which they were able to have those serendipitous types of collisions, so to speak. But for the most part, it was pretty seamless in people being able to be resilient and continue with types of programming that they would need. However, one of the areas that we're still seeing a continuation of, and just kind of a little bit of a question mark, is when it comes to physical space. A number of our co-working spaces and physical incubators and accelerators, of course, folks weren't able to go in. And we're seeing more of this transition to hybrid work. People do want to come back into the offices, and we're seeing New York open up significantly. But I think startups, the tech sector, and just kind of businesses at large are trying to figure out this hybrid work environment, which is definitely a welcome change. But I think that it also offers a lot of opportunities for us to think about how are we going to conceptualize space now, office space, if we're going to be let's say folks are going to be in, a few times a week. And that's very ripe for the way New Yorkers and New York industries in the past have been very resilient, how entrepreneurship tends to surge after a number of different types of crises, or, with the pandemic, or after 2008, after 9/11. This is definitely an opportunity for us to innovate around how are we going to be using space, and what do co-working spaces look like. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities here as well, as we're thinking about moving forward within tech.
So that's actually a terrific transition. I think let's just start right in at this conversation about hybrid work, because, part of why I think we're all in a really good mood today, and I think it's worth remembering that when COVID began, there was no end date. So we were having to plan, what if this is 5 years? What if this is forever? What if, so it's easy to look out the window. It's a sunny, early summer morning. There's going to be this fantastic concert in, Central Park. There's all, Bruce Springsteen is back on Broadway. I mean, how can it not feel like we're going to have this kind of reawakening? But remote work has changed lots of things. And so I'd ask each of you, in terms of your roles, both the good and the bad, what has it made better? So for example, I'm commuting a whole lot less, which is productive as hell for me, but it's also changed some things. So let's talk about just, hybrid.
I'd say a big difference in our business of switching over to basically all virtual, being an investor, especially a seed stage investor, which is what we're focused on, is that I think right at the before this call, Karen was asking me any sectors that we kind of focus on, and I'm like, we're focused on really great founders first and foremost. So we invest across digital healthcare, fintech, CPG products, marketplaces, et cetera. And what drives us to our investments is really the founders themselves. And because at this early of a stage, whatever you put in a business plan or a deck often changes pretty dramatically. But the common thread of that success is usually the founders. And so changing your style from going from getting to know someone in person, multiple meetings, face to face, having a meal with them, getting to really get to know them, because that journey of early stage investor to that founder could be a 10+ year journey, and it'll go through some ups and downs, guaranteed. And so not having that kind of high fidelity relationship where you get to meet with that person face to face and spend it in real time was a big adjustment for us. But we still kind of had our most active year ever last year. But to be honest with you, we talk about internally as well, and we're like, did we make the best calls? We don't know yet. And now that we're getting to meet some of these founders face to face, it's actually interested seeing how that dynamic is changed. And luckily, I think it's been more positive than negative, which could have meant we might have missed on some really great opportunities because we didn't get to meet face to face. So we're very much in the people business, and I would say founders who are operating companies are very much also their number one thing is build a great team and manage their people. And I think that face to face connectivity is still going to be really important, no matter how good technology has gotten.
I'll jump in. Yeah. So I think that this, just building off of what we were talking about in regards to, earlier we were talking about kind of remote events, conferences, things of that nature. One of the tremendous benefits that we've seen from it is that when we look at some of the programs that we have, a number of meetups, for example, throughout the city, a number of kind of the boot camps and workforce development opportunities, because things are more remote and happen over the course of this past year, it's provided two opportunities. One is greater access to more people, across the city. You don't necessarily have to be physically present, and go to a location, in Manhattan or wherever it is. It's just, folks from across the 5 boroughs can participate, as well as scale. So a number of the programs that we've seen that were capped at, let's say, 30 people could attend this event or could attend a particular training. Now, because of the remote opportunities, we were able to offer it to a lot more people. And so it definitely had a lot of benefits when it comes to that kind of access and scale. One of the city's strategy over the course of the past decade when it comes to trying to help the tech sector develop is actually thinking about these clusters. And that's what New York City is known for, is this kind of opportunity to be able to meet people at these events and, at these shared workspaces, and have this kind of collision or serendipitous, encounter where, you're working on, you're trying to troubleshoot some, marketing question, or, developing a product and you have some questions and meet someone in the kitchen and you're able to kind of, from another company and discuss that with them. That's definitely an aspect where I think that there's a lot of creativity and shared knowledge that could take place. And so I think that folks are definitely looking forward to coming back to that as well, to be able to share that knowledge across the tech sector and across startups too. So there are definitely benefits to both, and this hybrid work model, I think, could benefit both of these aspects.
One of the other things about hybrid work that's not necessarily unique to tech, but I think does impact the tech sector specifically, because the tech sector tends to skew a little bit younger. The employee base is a little bit younger. A lot of people have young kids. I have young kids, as I'm sure you can tell from my background. Some of the upsides to hybrid work had nothing to do with work, but everything to do with the rest of your life. And so, my own personal experience, my older kid is in kindergarten. He was luckily in school for a lot of the year, and I was able to take him to school every morning. I've never taken him to school every morning before. I was always running around at morning meetings at work. And that was amazing. And I'm going to take him to school from now on, and I'm just going to start a little bit later. And like, that's how it's going to be, because we like chat the whole way and it's adorable. So I think that that's true for all kinds of people, because again, not unique to tech, but because tech does have a younger workforce, I think a lot of people are in a similar situation that I am. And the hybrid kind of working for me reminded me about some things that, also like working out or other stuff, seeing whatever it is, things that like make you a better person and a better worker and a better whatever. I think a lot of us the upside to this, there were obviously so many downsides. I don't mean to diminish that, but the upside is that you were able to kind of reintroduce yourself to some of those things. And I hope that sticks around. I think that while there are a lot of positives to hybrid work, I am a firm believer, and I'm not actually, this is not a value judgment, but I think that once everyone starts going back, everyone's going to start going back. I think that's human nature, and people are going to be in the office and people are going to be meeting for meetings. And I think that inertia is really going to bring folks back more than we all think it is. So my sense is that by next year, people will be back, but there will be, I hope the thing will retain is more flexibility for walking your kid to school or making time to work out or whatever the thing is that isn't work, but that makes you a happier human. Like, I hope that we have more space for that post-COVID.
The great thing about what's happening in New York City tech is that it's growing so quickly, and there's real competition for talent. And so at the end of the day, the talent, the employees are going to dictate like whether it's hybrid, whether it's all virtual versus, being all in the office and how that works. I think everyone's trying to feel that through, especially after we've gone through the past year and a half as we have. But I do think if people, on this panel or the audience, are kind of worrisome it's going to be dictated from the top, I don't think that's going to be the case at all. I think it's going to be dictated by the employees and them saying what's working for them, and their preference is going to dictate company policy.
I totally agree. Like, it used to be snacks and ping pong tables, and now it's going to be the ability to like work from home or whatever.
That's exactly right. That's exactly.
The other thing on the hybrid stuff that I think is really relevant and important to New York is that New York City, one thing, I mean, there are so many things that makes New York stand apart from everywhere else. But one of those things is actually bigger than just the city itself. And it's that New York is unique in this country in that it has really robust regional transit, which means you can live in the city, you can live in the suburbs, you can live in the country, you can live in the beach, you can live in all these places and still get into New York City easily a couple days a week. And you can have all these different lifestyles and jump on Amtrak or jump on Metro North. Like, nowhere else in the country really has that. Now, I understand, from an economic point of view, from a tax-based point of view, why you want people living in the city. But at the end of the day, I feel very strongly that as long as New York keeps those jobs, even if people are living regionally, like New York City will be, when you take a long view, like New York City will be fine as long as that's the case. And I think that's directly relevant to the hybrid model, because some of those folks who might live a little farther out because they want a totally different lifestyle, a hybrid work scenario is what will make that attainable. Again, if you only need to come in 2 or 3 days a week, all of a sudden an hour and a half train ride isn't so bad.
So here's some data. So I knew I was going to be speaking to 3 smart people, so I reached out to our friend Maria Gotch at the Partnership for NYC, and she said, oh, interestingly, we have new data coming out tomorrow. I love when that happens. So the partnership has done a survey. It says that 60% of NYC office workers will be back in the office at least 3 days a week by September. Now, the data is a little skewed because it's real estate and finance. It's startup is a smaller subset of that. But the one thing she said to me, and I thought this was worth saying out loud, the change that we're not aware of is what long-term happens to real estate, because people that have long-term, that have leases aren't going to generally break their leases in great big office towers. But when they get to the ends of those leases, they're going to rethink. If people are working 3 days a week, maybe we share a desk, or maybe people don't get as many private offices. So there is still this kind of what happens to New York long term about the economics of real estate that I think impacts all of us. That being said, I think this is a good time to talk about big tech. So before COVID, Facebook, Google, Apple, Disney were all on their way to gobbling up great big pieces of Hudson Yards and other big chunks of real estate. How is the growth of big tech slowed or changed by hybrid and COVID? Or do you think that it's still on this growth trajectory and no slowdown in sight?
I mean, listen, those big tech companies are the only companies who doubled down on New York City during COVID, like in the middle of COVID, signed huge new leases. Facebook and Amazon both signed huge new leases in Manhattan. Google had just before COVID committed to a huge project in Hudson Square and remains committed to it. And I think that's really important. I think it's really meaningful. I think it's great for New York. I think it's great for those companies. I think it's great for startups. That kind of like ecosystem effect where you have really big employers paying young engineers, hopefully a lot of money. Hopefully those young engineers leave the big companies, start new companies. It's all in New York. They're building networks. Like that's transformative. And I think you cannot understate just how meaningful it was at those companies in the middle of the pandemic. And by the way, in like the first half of the pandemic, when there were still, things felt so unknown, like said, we're here. And there was a lot of press around it. I think that was so important.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these companies had already, laid, have put their bet in New York, and as Julie mentioned, they keep on doubling down on it because their existing employee base that are based in New York have spoken. They're like, hey, we're here, we're going to stay here, and these guys have invested and kind of plant their flag in a really meaningful way. Like I was talking to a senior product guy at Instagram, and I was talking to about them starting the office at Instagram in New York from a product and engineering perspective, right? Not just usually it's just like an ad sales team or whatever, but they built out a really meaningful product engineering team. I said, oh, this product engineering team that works in New York, like where do they work on? Like what products, as part of Instagram do they work on? And he said that they actually, the team that he worked on was specifically around the homepage and the newsfeed, which are basically the keys to the castle for that business. I mean, it's the most important part of their business from the consumer perspective. And I was like, wow, that's a pretty big bet to start a new office and to move, like give the keys to the castle to that new team. And they basically said, like, look, if we're starting an office that's not HQ in New York, we didn't want it to be like the Skunk Works office. We wanted to send a message to the talent in New York that we know the talent's great here. And we want to make sure we're making a statement by saying, like, look, join our team. You're going to work on the keys of the castle here and the most critical parts of the business. And that's the message they wanted to send because they knew how strong the market was here, the talent level here. And they wanted to make sure they built their brand to the employee base they were trying to recruit. And so if that's indicative of like, pre-pandemic, how much of a bet they were making on New York, as Julie just mentioned, they continue to double and triple down because those teams are working incredibly well. And those companies know that, for them, their companies continue to grow and scale, they need to make sure they're investing heavily in what's happening here in New York.
So when I think about big companies and New York and their fondness for New York and their embracing New York, there's one that's always missing. And I've been thinking about this, just puzzling. Maybe one of you guys has wisdom about it. Why don't we have Elon? Why isn't he building one of the Boring Company tunnels for us? Like, he seems to have an anti-New York. He doesn't say it out loud.
Oh, wait, we've got the stuff upstate. We have a presence upstate. There's a big Tesla presence. They're building a lot of the batteries near Buffalo, right?
I'm talking about love. I'm talking about just Elon showing up and doing an event and wandering the city and eating a hot dog and doing all that.
He just hosted Saturday Night Live.
Fair enough. Good point. Good point.
Come on.
By the way,
absolutely.
Well played. Fair enough. So let's talk about.
Also, wait, he did, Karen. I'm sorry, I'm not done with Elon yet. Karen, he did something during COVID. He helped something during COVID, didn't he? Wasn't there? Do you remember?
Specifically for New York, I'm not sure.
All right. Well, we're going to invite him to speak at a New York City media lab event.
Ventilators. That's right. So he helped with the ventilators.
All right, so I want to talk about one of my pet peeves about New York tech is I feel like we don't get enough press for our awesomeness, and I'll just give you an example. There was a transaction last week, Stack Overflow, sold for $1.8 billion. I'm told that there was something like 60 new millionaires minted out of that transaction. All of those people, I hope, are staying and are going to take a couple of months off and go to the beach and then come back and be like, what do I do? Okay, let's build something. So like there are great New York, exit stories, Asana, before that I think I think could use more of our internal buzz. Do any of you have like great New York win stories that we should amplify while we're here?
I mean, sure. Ben, I mean, our end. Yeah, over the last year, we've had a ton of success. I mean, I remember when the pandemic hit, I called Bryn Putnam, who is a founder and CEO of Mirror, the connected device, fitness device company. And I'm like, is your business going to be okay? And she goes, every day right now is like Black Friday, Cyber Monday, right? 100% of the gyms across the country were closed, right? So she's just like, oh my God, we can barely keep up with demand. And so, Bryn then sold her company in the middle of the pandemic to Lululemon for $500 million, which was a great outcome. We just had a company officially go public yesterday, Latch, another connected hardware device company, a smart lock, smart access company. And again, that's a company that we were kind of, a seed round investor in. I met an entrepreneur playing basketball at Stuyvesant High School about 10 years ago, became an investor and board member from that, from helping him with the idea and then investing really early on. And that company, eventually, it was a Korean e-commerce company, so he left New York to start it in Korea. But Coupang just went public about 3 months ago and is now the largest e-commerce company in Korea and valued at about $70 billion. So luckily, I think what's happened with the pandemic for tech is that it was an accelerant for so many of these businesses. And I can kind of list a ton in our portfolio here. And so if you look across the New York City market, we used to celebrate like it was a special event when there was an IPO. And I'm just pulling up a list over the last 12 months. We've had Squarespace, BarkBox, UiPath, Compass, Olo, DigitalOcean, ACV Auctions, Oscar, Lemonade, Vroom. We have a couple that are coming up deck like Zeta, Sprinkler. So that's just like a small sample of the amount of companies in just the last 12 months that went public in New York City. So it's been an incredible ride over the last year, and I think it's just going to continue to accelerate. And our thesis has always been success breeds success. So, what you see now is just only the tip of the iceberg.
Great.
So
Karen, you go ahead.
Go ahead, Julie, and then I'll go after you. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I would echo everything Ben said. And every day, like this morning, Clear filed its assessment. Like it's every day you read about another New York company going public. It's unbelievable. But when you take that piece plus the large companies doubling down, like that's a real ecosystem effect. That's how you're pumping money in, how you're training new people, how you're becoming more and more a part of the city. And I think that is such a crucial, key to the success of New York City's tech sector. And the last quick thing I want to say about that, and then Karen, I feel like I've been talking a lot and I'm dying to hear what you have to say about this. But when we first started Tech NYC just about 5 years ago, there was still kind of this feeling, I think for a lot of young engineers in particular, that it was tough to build an entire career here. That you could come to New York for a job, but it wasn't necessarily clear that you could find your second, third, or fourth job here. And I think that created a bit of a chilling effect, let's say, that kind of slowed the growth. Like that is so far gone, in the past 5 years, something like totally shifted with regard to that dynamic. There is no doubt that you can come to New York, you can work at huge companies, you can work at a bank, you can work at a tiny startup and everything in between and have an incredibly rich career. People in tech tend to jump a lot. So, you're not going to like come probably and work at one company necessarily for your whole career, but you can build a really robust, interesting career in tech here now. And when that kind of shook free, when that became the reality, I feel like then we were off to the races. And when you take that, plus again, all the IPOs and all the success that we're breeding from homegrown companies, plus the presence of the largest employers, like that's the recipe for success.
Karen, you want to add?
Yeah, what I was going to say is that, we've seen just the incredible growth of tech in New York, and we've seen all of, just Ben, we just, kind of went off and discussed a lot of the huge wins that we've had, especially during the course of this past year. What we've also seen this past year is, tech hiring has been, greater than healthcare hiring. It's just been incredibly robust. We've seen investments in New York City, over $16 billion of VC investments, record-breaking year. But one of the areas that I do want to kind of double down on in this conversation is that even though we're seeing this incredible growth across demand for workforce, across investment into founders, even seeing kind of a lot of the innovations and a lot of the sectors that have grown as a result of COVID, some that were just mentioned here as well, there was a huge disparity. And, I feel like a tremendous obligation, as being part of the city and as part of what we're trying to do with tech here, to talk about, even though there's been an incredible amount of investment, hiring, et cetera, we've seen a lot of the disparities COVID very much highlighted that existed before, but COVID exacerbated it, highlighted it very much so. When we look at, the workforce in New York, in the tech sector, it is not diverse. It's more so than the rest of the country, but it's definitely something that we need to take action on. And it's going to require the public sector, government like themselves, New York City Economic Development Corporation, other city agencies, state, federal, et cetera, partnering with the private sector, because these types of jobs, whether it's specific tech jobs or jobs in the tech sector, are growing tremendously. There's a lot of demand for these types of jobs, and they pay a lot more as well. When we look at funding for founders of color and for women, Black and Latino founders, received about 3% of VC funding. That's abysmal. When we look at founders of color who ultimately go into being investors, the numbers are really terrible as well. There needs to be a concerted effort, and this is one thing that New York City is definitely trying to underscore, is that we need greater equity when it comes to thinking about the tech sector and how we make sure that all New Yorkers have access to these opportunities as part of the workforce, as investors, as founders themselves. How do we make sure that all of the benefits of tech are actually going to all of us? And there are two other points that I wanted to make, and that is, another area that COVID has highlighted is the need for small businesses to adapt to tech as well. So we've seen, e-commerce rise, the importance of small businesses digitizing payments, digitizing their operations. When we look at small businesses that employ over 60% of New Yorkers, 41% of small businesses, of Black small businesses actually, ended up closing. That's significant, and when you look at the percentage of Black and Latino small businesses, only 12% of them received PPE funding. A lot of these small businesses need to incorporate technology to think about pivoting their business models, thinking about incorporating tech to a large degree as well. And that's incumbent on all of us to work together to make sure that that's an area that we're focused on. And finally, the other area that I wanted to talk about is just kind of the general public and how tech is affecting the general public as well. Now, when we're across the country, and particularly here in New York City, one of the main areas we need to focus on is broadband access. And that's one of the areas that we are focused on in the city, is to make sure that we're scaling access to affordable, reliable broadband throughout the city. But, that's been a problem, to make sure that kids are able to access school, people are able to work remotely, thinking about digital literacy and making sure that people understand how their information is being used, understanding cybersecurity, both for individuals as well as for small businesses. There's still a lot of work that we need to do when it comes to the tech sector and making sure that all benefit and all are protected from, what's being developed and what's being kind of the services, the products. How do we make sure that it's benefiting all of us?
Thank you. All right, so we're going to move to audience questions. And I want to begin with Dawn Barber's question. Dawn is on our advisory board and a friend of the Media Lab. And she asks, what issues do you think our next New York City mayor must focus on to support our tech and media ecosystem? Perfect question.
I think Karen's last comment, focused on a lot of those things. So I think she kind of answered it. In fact, I was going to write in the chat that, Dawn, that I think Karen was answering a lot of your questions there. I mean, one of the things that I think we really need to see from the next administration is frankly a real focus on these issues from the top. Like I hope that the next administration has a deputy mayor for technology. I think that we need to see that the next administration is like hyper focused on making sure that there's equitable growth of technology, and that the city knows how to work with the private sector. The city knows how to, bring the public sector into that conversation, and that there's someone who's like got a senior role in the government with real authority to get that done.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, I think for me, the issue that Karen definitely touched upon was the lack of diversity in the tech sector. And I think a lot of that is just driven by the lack of exposure, especially among the Black and Latinx community, to what's really kind of happening there and to the jobs and the opportunities there, and bridging that community to what's happening in the startup ecosystem. I mean, there's tons of companies, tons of people employed at these companies, but you walk through the halls, it's single-digit percentage in terms of Black Latinx employees. And that's a major issue. So when you talk to us as investors and say, hey, why aren't you guys investing more on Black or Latinx founders? I'm like, look, we invest in tech companies. And if you haven't ever worked in a tech company, you're less likely to start a tech company, right? So for example, our industry is heavily investing in like B2B, like fintech companies, infrastructure companies. If you've just never worked at a fintech company, it's really hard to ever start a fintech company. So, I mean, that's just how it works. And so one of those things that I tell folks is that we just need, we have this amazing population, a diverse population in the city, but it feels like there's this, this lack of connectivity from the industry to that population. And it just continues to, in my opinion, have gotten worse and worse. And for the city to grow in the tech sector and to thrive, we need to figure out how to bridge that.
All right. So our next question is from our friend Marcos Dinnerstein, and he asks, would you weigh in on the question of admissions to specialized high schools in New York City? STI, Brock Science, Brooklyn Tech. And then he says, disclosure, my father went to Brock Science and our son went to STI. These schools are feeders to NYC's NYC tech community.
I mean, I can go, but no, Ben, you go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure what specifically it was, if the question is just about how important those schools are to.
There's been admissions drama about who's getting in and who's not, and what the mix of the admissions balance looks like.
Sure. I mean, my son is going to take the test for specialized high schools this fall. We live a few blocks away from Stuyvesant High School. I didn't go to a specialized high school. I went to a Cardozo High School in Queens. But I've had plenty of friends that went there, and I think going to a Stuyvesant or Bronx Science or Brooklyn Tech or the many other really great specialized high schools could be, really transformative in people's lives. I think a lot of controversy has been around how it skews definitely among the Asian American population. And I understand the concerns, but it's, a lot of the Asian American population that does apply to these schools. They don't come from, very strong socioeconomic backgrounds. I think culturally, the community has just been very, very driven, by parents and by your friends and your cousins and your family to just aspire to go to these schools. And so a lot of time and energy gets really invested from these communities. And so I think the, admissions issue is a very complex one. It's definitely out of kind of what I do as an expert, but I can definitely tell you from someone that's, been born and raised here and has children here. I think it's a very complex issue, and those schools are really important, and trying to navigate that is definitely complex. As far as it affects the tech community, I've had, a partner in my startup, went to Stuyvesant High School. He was an African-American guy. Omar Wasso was president of his student class. Omar's an amazing human being. And so, talent from those schools have impacted, my career journey in a major way.
Can I add layer on top of this really quickly? I'm taking it a little sideways because I'm not going to talk about the high schools, but I wanted to also talk about CUNY for a second, which when you take the specialized high schools, when you take CUNY, New York is light years beyond anywhere else in the country. When we talk about economic, we need to do a lot more, but we have economic mobility. We have institutions that can help spur economic mobility, and those institutions are here and they need more support, and we need to grapple with some of these really complicated questions. But just today, my team, we were talking about, I think it's 4 of the top 10 institutions in the nation that spur economic mobility. CUNY is 4 of the top 10. 5 of the top 10, I was just corrected. 5 CUNY schools, which is an amazing statistic. CUNY's hundreds of thousands of New York City kids, students, adults, who actually mirror the diversity of New York. And it's incredibly affordable. And this is something that the next mayor needs to focus on, that we should see legislators in the state focusing on, ensuring that CUNY as an engine for economic growth, for economic mobility is strong, that we're really helping create the pipeline, not just to CUNY, but from CUNY into tech. You see a lot of this happening already, and there's so much more to do. I feel like, I've lived all over the country. I don't know anywhere else that has a CUNY, that has an institution, which is a number of institutions really rolled into one, to work with like that. It's an amazing opportunity.
All right, so I'm going to end with one last question. Who are New York's competitors? Who do we lose companies to? And extra credit for anyone that wants to say anything about San Francisco.
Oh, I'm happy to talk about San Francisco. I mean, listen, I think New York only stands to benefit from what's happening on the West Coast. I think that when it comes to tech, I think that, again, like I said earlier, for a long time, there was a lot of inertia that if you wanted to work in tech, you kind of went to the Bay. It's kind of where the jobs were. And all of a sudden now you can kind of go anywhere. And I think that's why you're seeing so many people leaving. I think it's why you're seeing so many people come here. And I think the flip of that coin is that for a long time, people in tech who worked in New York chose to be in New York. And that's a really important dynamic. It's like people who wanted to be in New York. Inertia didn't bring them here. They made an active choice. I think there are other cities who are also benefiting from that. Mid-sized cities, more the kind of regional hubs. And I have to say that I know my job is just to cheerlead for New York, but I would also say that it is important for this country. It's important for this nation that the economic development that tech drives is realized, across the country. And so I'm actually really encouraged by seeing some of these regional tech hubs pop up as well.
Steve, I wanted to chime in just on the last question. So don't want to derail you. I know we don't have a ton of time, but I did want to speak to the specialized high schools and what we were talking about. Definitely.
You have 30 seconds.
Okay. What I did want to mention was that, opportunities like Bronx Science and STI, I went to science. And so it's definitely an opportunity where you do see a lot of folks who have, doors open to them when they do come from kind of more kind of working class backgrounds. What I do want to say is that, the alternative a lot of students have going to their zone schools, and I know that things have changed right now. I think we need to also focus on how do we make sure that all high schools are competitive? How do we make sure that your zone local school is a school that everybody wants to go to? Because I didn't have that option. I mean, it was not a very good option for me. And so I think that's another area that we need to double down on, is to make sure that every school across the 5 boroughs have the opportunities and resources that the specialized high schools do.
I want to thank my panel. You guys were amazing. Big round of applause for everybody.
Wait, I want that applause from last time. Oh, there it is. The sound effects are especially nice.
Thank you all. Fantastic. Appreciate the work that you do in the city of New York, and excited about the work we're all doing together. With that, we are moving on to our next panel. We're going to talk about AI and local news, and our panel is ready to go. So Shara from Bloomberg, who's a product manager for news and data science. Take it away, Shara.